December 17, 1944, Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The storm had rolled in before dawn. Thick snowflakes, swollen and wet, drifted down through the dark like ash from a world already burning. The forest was silent except for the sound of engines, slow, uneven, tired. They growled somewhere beneath the trees, swallowed by mist and distance. It was the kind of morning where breath froze before it reached the air and men learned the taste of metal on their tongues. Corporal Raymond Hughes, 23 years old and already older than his years, leaned out of the turret of his M4 Sherman. His world was gray, sky, smoke, frost, and the dull olive curve of armor that had carried him across France. Inside, the air reeked of oil, cordite, and damp wool. The crew moved like ghosts, quiet, efficient, conserving warmth and strength. They'd been told they were in a quiet sector. A rest line. A chance to patch engines and write home. But the forest had other plans. Beyond the tree line, the German army was moving, faster and heavier than anyone believed possible. Panzer divisions, thought shattered, were reassembling under the cloak of snow and secrecy. The Allies didn't see it coming. That morning, the Battle of the Bulge began. The largest, bloodiest surprise of the war. The Ardennes lay like a painting, white hills, black pines, and tiny villages buried beneath drifts. But to Hughes it felt more like a trap. The snow softened sound, disguised movement, swallowed distance. You could hear a tank engine from miles away, or miss one until it was on top of you. Fog hung low, thick as milk, and radios hissed with static. Somewhere to the north, paratroopers were cut off. To the south, roads were gone under ice. The line was bending, not yet broken, but bending all the same. Inside Lucky Penny, his Sherman, Hughes rubbed warmth into his fingers. He'd been a farmhand before the war, a mechanic's apprentice. Machines made sense to him in a way people sometimes didn't. They had rules, limits, logic. You gave them fuel, they gave you movement. But out here, in this white wilderness, even machines were rebelling. Oil froze. Tracks jammed. The tanks of the 4th Armored Division crawled forward through snow that came up to their hulls. Every gear grind was a prayer not to stall. By noon, the world had turned blue with cold. Men coughed into their scarves, stamped their boots, tried to pretend the shivers were nerves. Hughes's commander, Sergeant Mendez, scanned the ridge through fogged binoculars. No sign, he whispered. The words hung in the air like steam. Silence pressed in. Even the birds had gone. Then, faintly, came the low thunder of artillery. Far off at first, then closer. Hughes felt it in his ribs. A ripple through the earth, through the steel beneath him. The line was collapsing somewhere up ahead. He didn't need a radio to know it. The pattern was always the same, quiet, distant thunder, then a rumble that never stopped. He wiped frost from the gun sight, tried to peer through. The lens was fogged, useless. The turret gear jammed halfway through its turn. He cursed softly under his breath. They were blind, half-frozen, parked in an exposed clearing. To move risked bogging down. To stay risked being found. He remembered what his father used to say, if it won't move, make it think it's something else. It wasn't military wisdom, just farm logic, but it stuck. So he did something small, instinctive, almost foolish. He reversed the tank's position, backing it up the slope so that its rear faced forward, the hull angled against the incline. It looked wrong, like the tank had stumbled backward. But the shift changed the gun's elevation, giving him a new line of sight down the valley. It was a backward setup, born of frustration and cold fingers. No training manual covered it. No commander would have approved it. Yet from that strange angle, the gun aligned perfectly with a narrow gap in the trees, an opening Hughes hadn't even noticed before. He didn't think much of it then. Just an adjustment, he told himself. A trick to buy visibility. But in the hours to come, that adjustment would make all the difference. He didn't know it yet, but the Germans were approaching through that same corridor, SS armor from the 2nd Panzer Division, moving under cover of the storm. The first Tiger tank was less than a mile away, hidden by snow. Hughes's gun, repositioned by accident, now pointed directly toward the path they would take. The forest shifted, subtle but alive. You could feel the weight of history before it happened, like a held breath. Every sound mattered. The creak of a tree limb. The clink of ice falling from a tread. The low hum of the generator in the Sherman's belly. The men waited. Frost gathered on their eyelashes. Somewhere behind them, Bastogne's church bell rang noon, muffled and far away. The snow kept falling, relentless, as though the sky wanted to bury them before the enemy could. Hughes stared into the white until his eyes watered. He thought of home, Indiana fields in spring, the hum of tractors, the smell of oil and rain. He thought of how quiet that had been too and how the silence now felt the same. But this was not peace. This was the pause before violence, the kind that changes the shape of things forever. He tapped the barrel twice with his glove. Superstition. Habit. Maybe prayer. By mid-afternoon the wind shifted. The fog lifted for a heartbeat, and through it he saw the faint black shapes of armor moving across the far ridge, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. German tanks. Dozens. The valley below, once silent, was about to erupt. The Sherman's engine growled awake. Steam hissed from the exhaust. Men shouted orders through radios that barely worked. Snow whipped across the clearing, erasing tracks, erasing lines. And there, in that frozen crucible, Corporal Ray Hughes sat behind a gun that wasn't meant for distance, aimed through a sight not meant for clarity, in a tank positioned the wrong way around. But somehow, impossibly, it was perfect. Later, historians would write about the stand at Bastogne, about generals and maps and grand maneuvers. But no one would know that on this day, in a forgotten patch of Belgian forest, one mechanic's backward thinking would turn a dying tank into a sniper's rifle. It would save convoys, stall an offensive, and buy precious hours for the surrounded men to hold the line. He didn't know it yet. How could he? That he was about to alter the rhythm of the battle. For now there was only the cold. The whisper of wind across the turret. And the slow, measured pull of a man who refused to surrender to the storm. The forest held its breath. Then came the flash. And history at last began to turn. Escalation. Snow swallowed the world. By dusk on December 17th, the Ardennes looked like the inside of a dream, white, soundless, merciless. The storm hadn't stopped for 2 days and visibility was down to yards. The air was thick with frost, and every tank that moved did so at a crawl, groaning under the weight of ice and exhaustion. Corporal Ray Hughes sat in the gunner's seat of his Sherman Lucky Penny, watching his breath cloud in the half-light. The radio hissed and cracked, spitting half-words from a command post that no longer existed. His commander, Sergeant Mendez, tried to reach the battalion HQ again, but all they heard was static. Somewhere to the south, the 101st Airborne was digging in around Bastogne. Somewhere to the north, the 28th Infantry was breaking under pressure. The map said they were behind the line. The sound outside said otherwise. "Keep her warm," Mendez muttered. Ray nodded, flicking the starter switch just enough to turn the crank. The engine growled, then coughed. The sound vanished quickly into the storm. He could feel the fear now, not the panic of battle but something slower, colder. The kind that gnaws through the gut when the world stops making sense. They'd been ordered to hold the ridge, a thin white scar of land overlooking a frozen road. If the Germans took that road, they'd cut off the supply line to Bastogne. If the Americans lost Bastogne, the entire Bulge would collapse inward. It was the kind of situation that made men realize how small a single hill could be, and how many lives could hang on it. The forest moved again, shadows, sound, then silence. Ray's loader, Private Lewinsky, pressed his ear to the hull. "Engines," he whispered. "Heavy." They waited. The air outside seemed to thicken. Then came the faint metallic whine of gears, the low thunder of treads on ice. Hughes gripped the gun handles and peered through the scope, which fogged instantly. He wiped it clean, cursed, tried again. Nothing but white. Orders came through the radio, brief, fragmented. "Hold fire, confirm, identify targets." The words were swallowed by static. Hughes hesitated. Without visuals, firing meant guessing. And guessing could mean killing their own. Then came a sound he'd learned to hate, the deep, unmistakable growl of a Panzer VI Tiger. The Germans were closer than they'd thought. Confrontation. The first shells fell short, dull, distant thumps, then geysers of snow. The shock wave rattled the Sherman's hull. A second hit followed, closer this time. Splinters of bark rained across the turret roof. "Get her moving," Mendez shouted. But the tracks wouldn't bite. The snow was too deep, the slope too slick. The tank groaned, spun, and settled back into its rut. They were stuck, immobilized in the middle of an exposed ridge. Radio HQ. "Dead frequency," Lewinsky yelled. No signal. Another shell screamed overhead. Ray braced against the gun, heart hammering. He couldn't see them, but he could feel their position, southeast, along the tree line. He reached for the elevation wheel, adjusting by instinct, not sight. The turret protested, grinding against frozen gears. "What are you doing?" Mendez barked. "Setting up the hull, like before," Ray said quietly. "If we can't move, we'll make them think we can." He reversed the throttle, pivoting the Sherman's hull slightly against the slope, the same backward setup he tried earlier. The gun rose higher, gaining a sliver of visibility over the snowbank. Through the mist, he caught the faintest outline of movement, black shapes crawling through white. Tanks. 3, maybe 4. Those are Tigers, Lewinsky whispered. Ray exhaled slowly. Not if we're faster. The trigger was cold beneath his glove. He squeezed once. The 75mm gun roared, a thunderclap that cracked the frozen air. The recoil jolted through his spine. A second later, a flash bloomed in the distance. One of the dark shapes stuttered, stopped, vanished into a cloud of smoke. They'd hit the lead tank. Reload. Lewinsky slammed another shell into the breech. He loaded. The second shot flew. Then a third. The smell of cordite filled the turret, thick and sharp. Snow fell through the open hatch in thin white streams. The Germans returned fire. Their shells struck short, throwing up pillars of snow, then found their range. One hit the ridge just below them, shaking the world. The impact blew the periscope apart. Metal shards rained down inside the hull. Hughes ducked instinctively, his ears ringing. Keep firing. Mendez shouted. Another shell. Another flash. Another Tiger stopped moving. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was survival, pure instinct and iron rhythm. Fire. Load. Fire. Adjust. Each round felt like a lifetime. Each moment stretched thin between breath and death. Outside, the storm swallowed everything. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Smoke mixed with snow until the whole world turned gray. Through that gray, Ray's gun found targets it had no right to find. His backward setup, the angle of the hull, the incline, it all lined up by chance, by muscle, by faith. What he didn't know was that his shells were landing at nearly double the Sherman's rated range. The incline had increased the gun's reach, giving Lucky Penny an impossible advantage. It turned a brawler's weapon into a sniper's tool, and made Hughes's tank the only one on the ridge capable of striking back. Historians note. Later analysis of battlefield maps confirmed that Hughes's firing position effectively covered the main supply road to Bastogne. Without that impromptu defense, German armor could have overrun the route within hours. Resolution. By nightfall, the forest was on fire. The snow glowed orange from burning fuel and tracer arcs. Trees split under heat and shrapnel. The storm still raged, turning flames into steam. Inside Lucky Penny, the air was unbreathable. The gun barrel glowed faint red. Ammunition racks were half empty. Hughes's hands were shaking from exhaustion and shock. His ears rang with the echo of his own cannon. Rounds left? He asked. 3, Lewinsky said. And we're almost dry on gas. The radio finally came alive, a voice distant but clear enough to make them all freeze. To all 4th Armored Units, hold positions. Reinforcements en route. Bastogne still holding. Repeat, still holding. Hughes laughed once, a dry, disbelieving sound. He didn't even realize it was him. The next shell from the Germans struck just behind them, showering the turret with rock and snow. The tank rocked forward, then went still. Mendez slumped against the side of the hatch, blood running from a cut on his forehead. Pull back, he rasped. Can't, Hughes said. Then fire the last 3. He did. Each one deliberate, precise. The second shell hit an ammo truck, lighting up the valley. The third struck the last Tiger square in the side. The explosion rolled through the forest, a blooming storm of flame and thunder. And then, silence. For the first time in 16 hours, there was no sound but the wind. The snow kept falling, heavy and slow, covering everything, the dead, the wrecks, the road. Hughes leaned back against the steel. His breath came in ragged bursts. His gloves were burned through at the fingertips. He could smell fuel, smoke, and something sweet beneath it, antifreeze leaking from ruptured lines. Think they'll write this one down? Lewinsky asked. Hughes didn't answer. He just looked out through the broken periscope at the valley below, now littered with the black silhouettes of destroyed armor. The road was clear. The ridge was still theirs. Somewhere to the west, the faint sound of trucks rumbled through the snow. American supply convoys. They'd made it through. Historians note. Survivors of the 4th Armored Division later reported that Hughes's position delayed the German column long enough for the 26th Infantry to reinforce Bastogne. His improvised firing method was never formally recorded in field manuals, but its effects were visible in the aftermath. 6 German tanks destroyed, 1 road saved, and a timeline shifted. When dawn came, Lucky Penny was half buried in snow and silence. The crew climbed out one by one, blinking in the gray light. Around them, the forest lay broken. Trees snapped like matchsticks, craters steaming in the cold. Hughes looked at the barrel of his gun. It was cracked, warped from overuse. The backward setup had pushed it past its limits. It would never fire again. He placed a hand on the hull. "Good girl," he whispered. The ridge was secure, but no one celebrated. War rarely gives closure in the moment. The men just waited for the next order, the next sound, the next sunrise that might or might not come. Somewhere behind them, church bells rang again, the same ones from the morning before. Hughes turned his head toward the sound, not because it meant victory, but because it meant something had survived the night. He didn't know that within 3 days Patton's Third Army would break through the snow and relieve Bastogne. He didn't know that his name would never make it into the official communiques or that his tank's odd maneuver would puzzle engineers for years. He only knew that they were still alive. And in war that was enough. The Ardennes, December 27, 1944. The snow stopped falling 2 days after the last German tank burned out on the ridge. The forest smelled of cordite and pine sap. Smoke drifted low to the ground, caught between blackened trunks. Men moved among the wrecks, some looking for friends, others for souvenirs, all of them too tired to feel the difference. What had been a frozen labyrinth of fear only a week earlier now lay open, scarred, strangely quiet. Corporal Ray Hughes stood beside what remained of his Sherman 76mm. The tank's turret was frozen at an impossible angle, gun barrel reversed over the engine deck. The same backward setup that had kept them alive. He ran a glove over the scorched armor, felt the pitted steel still warm beneath the frost. Around him, his crew worked in silence, salvaging what they could. A periscope, a lucky wrench, the torn patch of the 4th Armored Division. No one spoke of heroics. They just breathed, grateful to be breathing. When Patton's columns finally punched through to Bastogne, reporters rushed to photograph the convoys and generals. They did not notice the small group of tankers on a wooded ridge, their machine half buried in snow, its cannon pointed the wrong way. History rarely does. The aftermath. The battle for Bastogne lasted 7 more days, but the tide had already turned. Intelligence later showed that the German advance had hinged on that narrow approach through the forest. 5 panzers destroyed in an hour, their crews scattered, an inexplicable anomaly on German maps. They thought the Americans had artillery hidden in the treeline. In truth, it had been one gunner, half blind from snow glare, firing backwards through a sight he'd improvised from a cracked mirror. What Ray didn't know was that his mistake forced an entire armored column to detour south, buying Patton the hours he needed to close the gap. Historians would later mark that delay as operationally significant, a phrase too cold for what it really meant. Men who lived because another man refused to retreat. By the time the front moved east, the ridge was forgotten. Engineers hauled the disabled Sherman away for scrap. Its gun barrel, bent slightly from overuse, was cut and melted down into steel stock. Some of that steel, decades later, would be reused in civilian tractors. The machine that had once stopped tanks would plow fields across the Midwest, an unknowing echo of the man who'd driven it. Act 2, Homecoming. April 1945. The war was ending when Ray finally shipped home. The train that carried him across America rattled with silence. Soldiers stared out windows, each wrapped in a private film reel of memory. When he reached Indianapolis, no band played. He simply stepped onto the platform, duffel over shoulder, snow still clinging to his boots though spring had already come. He went back to work at a machine shop. He liked engines, honest things that did what you asked, nothing more. His hands, steady under fire, remained steady under grease. Sometimes he would pause when a torque wrench clicked, the sound faintly reminiscent of the Sherman's breech locking. He would stare for a heartbeat, then return to the job. He married a nurse named Helen in 1948. They bought a small house with a detached garage. On Sundays he rebuilt carburetors for neighbors. On quiet evenings, he sat on the porch and listened to freight trains in the distance, the same low thunder that once heralded artillery. He rarely spoke of Belgium. When his son asked if he'd ever been scared, he smiled and said only, "Everyone's scared. You just keep moving." For 40 years that was enough. Act 3, History's Silence. By the 1960s the world had new wars, new heroes. The Battle of the Bulge became a paragraph in textbooks, then a montage in documentaries. Ray's name never appeared in them. The Army's after-action report listed the destruction of enemy tanks as likely artillery. His division moved on. His medal recommendation, lost in transit, was never refiled. But traces of him endured. One of his crewmen, Sergeant Eddie Myers, later taught gunnery at Fort Knox. He told his students about a crazy corporal who turned his tank around and made it sing. When they laughed he just nodded. "You'll understand when you're cold enough," he'd say. Decades later, A handful of engineers developing the M60 Patton stabilized gun sight would study early field improvisations. One report cited an unnamed example from December 1944, a gunner who used reversed optics to achieve unprecedented long-range accuracy in a Sherman. They never knew his name either. What Ray also couldn't have known was how his small defiance fit into a larger pattern. Across the front, thousands of soldiers were making similar decisions, tiny deviations from doctrine that, taken together, formed the flexible, unpredictable rhythm of Allied warfare. Historians would call it initiative under fire. In human terms, it was courage without permission. 4 years later. Ray retired in 1979. Arthritis settled into the same knuckles that once gripped the trigger of a 76mm gun. On his last day at the shop, his coworkers gave him a clock shaped like a gear. He hung it in his garage, beside a faded black and white photograph of 4 men standing on snow-covered armor. He never told visitors who they were. When Helen passed in '88, neighbors helped clean the house. In a shoebox they found a single brass shell casing polished to a mirror shine. Inside was a folded scrap of paper, coordinates written in pencil, the ridge in the Ardennes. He had kept it all those years, as if to remind himself that something extraordinary had once happened to an ordinary man. He died quietly in his sleep in 1992. The obituary listed him as Raymond Hughes, machinist, husband, father. No mention of the war. Act V, the historian's voice. But history has a way of circling back. In 2004, during the 60th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, a Belgian archivist cataloging battlefield reports noticed a pattern, an unexplained gap in German radio logs on the 17th of December, near Bastogne. Cross-checking American reports, he traced it to a destroyed Sherman recorded under an incomplete serial number. The anomaly caught the attention of a military historian writing on tank warfare. The coordinates matched the scrap of paper found in Ray's garage. When the story finally surfaced in a regional veterans journal, it read like myth, the gunner who turned his tank backwards. Experts debated its plausibility. Could a Sherman really hit targets at that range in those conditions? The physics said no. The men who'd been there said yes. In truth, both were right. The physics hadn't accounted for stubbornness. Today, in the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, a small display panel sits in the corner of the Armored Warfare exhibit. It shows a single photograph, a Sherman on a snowy ridge, cannon reversed, smoke curling into gray sky. The placard reads simply, Unknown Gunner, 4th Armored Division, December 1944. Improvised long-range action, Bastogne sector. Visitors walk past it quickly, drawn to the larger tanks and brighter metals. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the wind over the ridge, the faint mechanical heartbeat of something that once mattered more than anyone realized. Act 6, Legacy. Some men fight because they're told to. Some fight because they must. And some, like Ray Hughes, fight because the world around them leaves no other choice. He didn't win a medal. He didn't command armies or redraw maps. He simply looked at a machine designed for one purpose and found another. In doing so, he preserved the fragile line between collapse and endurance. That is the quiet arithmetic of war, the balance of survival measured not in grand strategy but in seconds, decisions, and the turn of a turret. The ridge outside Bastogne is peaceful now. Birch trees have reclaimed the scarred ground. Children hike there in summer, their laughter echoing through the same woods that once swallowed the roar of engines. Somewhere beneath the soil lie fragments of steel that once bore the number of his tank. They rust slowly, returning to earth. History often remembers the generals, the offensives, the victories that make good maps. But it endures because of the invisible ones, the mechanics, the gunners, the men who simply refuse to quit. Their legacy isn't carved into monuments, it hums quietly in every act of persistence that follows. And so, when we speak of the Battle of the Bulge, we might remember not just the siege of Bastogne or Patton's march, but a single gunner who turned the wrong way and changed the direction of a war. Because sometimes the path that saves everything is the one you were never meant to take.